Welcome, Sand People, to our Comic-Con studio. And Neil, if I can start with you. It has been 34 years since the first publication of The Sandman. And in your afterword, in the 30th anniversary edition, you said, reading it back, there were parts you thought were ungainly and awkward, and clumsy was another word you used. Now, I just wondered how much you enjoyed getting the chance to redress some of those moments.
Actually, what I think I experienced making it was slightly different to that, because instead of fixing things that were ungainly, awkward, or clumsy, which was where I began, there were an awful lot of times when I went, oh, actually, 27-year-old Neil Gaiman knew what he was doing, even if he didn't know why he knew that this was what he was doing. And that thing that I thought was clumsy, you know, some of the best brains in television have just been doing all of this stuff, and now we've gone in a giant loop and we've gone back to where the comic was, because that works better than anything else we've been able to come up with. So I'm actually a lot more forgiving of young Neil. I think he was much smarter than I thought he was.
What did you bring to the role of Dream that maybe wasn't on the page?
There is a misconception of Dream as somebody who doesn't feel, who doesn't love or empathize. And the thing that I came to understand was that he is the being that contains all of our fears and our fantasies, all of our dreams. And that, by definition, is all of our feelings. And the thing that makes him enclosed and withdrawn is the discipline that's required to hold that unconsciousness, that universal unconsciousness together, because if he doesn't, if it falls apart, then the consequences are catastrophic. And so I don't know if I brought anything to it, but what I was surprised by as someone who had read it so rigorously was how much he felt.
Boyd, your character is the Corinthian and is quite horrific. And I was surprised to get a glimpse of your eyes in, you know, the footage that's come out so far. But how did you react when you first saw what they'd done? I presume it's, you know, not prosthetics. Or
That actually, what we've got in right now is prosthetics. We were very, very lucky hiring Boyd, because he does actually have mouth eyes.
You know, we had a long talk, Allan and I and Neil, about just, I really loved the role, I loved the comic, I was fascinated with the world, but I was hung up on, well, how am I going to portray this character? So much of your acting is done with your eyes. And Allan reassured me, and so did Neil, that it's gonna be okay. It's all there, it's all within the action and how everything plays out. And really what's in the final product is really fantastic in terms of how shocking and surreal and just terrifying all that really is.
Whether you read the comics or just the scripts, after reading, what questions did you have about your characters? And did you ask Neil? Did you get answers?
I read the comics a very long time ago, and Death was one of the characters that stuck with me the longest. There are other specific lines and moments that stayed, but Death was a role that was particularly impactful. So many of the questions that I may have had were answered by revisiting the comic and reacquainting myself with this character that is so divergent from any other iteration of Death that we've ever seen, or at least what we see on TV and in film. We don't really get to see this, but this is an idea. This idea of death, if you do your digging, does exist in folklore and in mythology. This idea of essentially a psychopomp, who is someone who, or an entity, a being that transfers people from this life to whatever is the next, and they are a caring, nurturing figure. So for me, I think so many of the questions that I may have had, or perhaps questions that maybe other actors approaching this role would have had, were answered both in going back to the comic and then also just sort of looking outside of the traditional idea of death, or at least maybe like the Western idea of death, and finding stories and mythologies outside of that.
What was I asked you some questions. We had a meeting, I remember.
Well, the vortex as a concept is not an easy one to explain. And I think a lot of what we talked about was Rose's backstory for the show, which is slightly different from her backstory in the comic. And setting up this character who has lost both her parents, has lost her brother, you know, her only friend is Lyda Hall, and this is a young woman who has only taken care of other people her entire life. Her background, her parents fought a lot. Her mom was a single mom trying to make a living. And so she's never had the room in her life to dream her own dreams, to dream for herself. She was always dreaming about and for others. And the irony being that she is the most powerful dreamer in all of the universes. And there was a lot of talk about that and really digging into that in a way that, you know, I think we hadn't done in the comic, or Neil hadn't done in the comic, just sort of fleshing this out. And because we had more time, we could develop Rose's relationship with her brother. We flash back to their history. So I think it was mostly just sort of fleshing that out so that it felt like an experience that also, you know, Vanesu could relate to.
One thing that we talked about a lot was sort of desire being perceived as an antagonist, and you know, the fun about playing anyone that's antagonistic or villainous in any way, you know, is that they are the hero of their own stories, and that is incredibly true of Desire, especially. And one thing that Neil said that I always kind of latched onto that I found was very, very fun was that he's like, you know, I always envisioned that Sandman definitely is a story that could be told entirely from Desire's perspective, and that version of the story was probably a lot more fun and has a lot more sex in it. But you know, but we are entering this world and this universe through Dream and experiencing everything from his perspective. So that shifts, obviously, the way that each character is sort of perceived. And so that was really helpful to kind of keep going back to it and being like, yeah, I should just be having a lot of fun with this.
Were you particularly happy with any specific changes that you got to make for the television series?
Most of the changes that we made for the television series were made because we were making television. And I was incredibly happy with them because we were making television. What Allan and his collaborators did is astonishing. It is incredibly dark. It takes you into the absolute heart of darkness. We filmed a lot of stuff that we wound up not using because it felt like it was going too far. So, and again, we wound up, I think at the end, doing much more horror inside your head than we expected to, and letting some of the terrible things that we shot and that we've all experienced, at least Allan and I have experienced in various edits and cuts, and eventually going, you know, it works better if that thing just happened and we come back in here and it's already happened.
As an enormous fan, the first thing I wanted to do was completely, literally recreate the Morpheus that's on the page, and we did that. We did loads of camera tests. We painted my skin as white as an A4 piece of paper. I had black contacts with stars in them. I had huge, wild hair, and it was amazing, and it really did look exactly like the Sandman that we know. But what Neil said was so important, was that if Morpheus walks amongst the world, walks down the streets of New York, no one should bat an eyelid. He should have a presence, but no one should think that this endless being is amongst them. And if I walked down the corridor of Shepperton Studios, dressed as I was then, people would be like, whoa, dude, where are you going? And it just didn't work. And I know that people, you know, that one of the things that the fans will question is some of the changes in the way he looks. And that really all came from Neil and his advice. And we slowly whittled it down to, wait a second, Tom, sickly pale anyway, and your hair is always a mess, and when I look into your eyes I can see the cosmos, so we were fine.
I think for me the biggest was probably costume, actually. Like, I feel like we went through various iterations of Johanna Constantine's costume, and like there was a version which were very much like the trench coat, kind of more like the comic book character, and then moving into the kind of this iteration of Johanna Constantine as the upgraded, exorcist to the royal family that we have. So I'd say those were kind of a lot of the shifts and changes that we had.